Did you know that each member of Queen wrote a chart-topping hit and that they're the only band in history to achieve this?
What? What? Nah, I never knew that. I never knew that.
I'm going to tackle this subject as a two-parter for once, so it's a little bit of a different format. Basically, I had loads to say, so please tell me if you like this or whether you just prefer me to make really long videos. Okay, let's get straight down to it. It actually took me a little while to work out exactly how many number ones Queen had in total and what they were. Wikipedia is, of course, the go-to source, and it is decent, but for some reason, the Queen discography page misses out how well the singles did in some countries, like France. You would expect it to include France, right? But I'm sure there's some reason. Anyway, it took a bit of Googling and looking around a bunch of different fan sites and country-specific historical charts, but I now have, hopefully, a comprehensive breakdown of Queen's singles. And I think every number one they had in any country. As I'm sure we all already know, it's a very impressive list. They released 23 singles in the 70s, 28 in the 80s, and then things obviously slowed down a lot in the 90s with Freddie's illness and death, but they still put out, by my count at least, 11 new singles. There were a bunch of re-releases and things like that, so their 90s discography is a bit more complicated. Overall though, that makes, according to my count, 62 singles across the 3 decades that they were all together with all the members. Now I'm sure that some Queen geek is going to pop into my comments and tell me that actually I've got the number slightly wrong somewhere, because actually I am missing out the Bhutan only release of Gimme the Prize in the early 90s or something like that, but this will have to do for now. So the thing is, out of all of those singles, most of them are very good. Lots of them are very, very good, and a shockingly large amount are amongst the greatest pop or rock songs ever by any band, bridging progressive rock, hard rock, pop, funk, a bunch of other styles. I personally think that they might have had the greatest run of singles of any band ever, with only, obviously, the Beatles competing with them. Anyway, out of all those singles, they had 13 number ones across the world. They had 4 in the 70s, that's Bohemian Rhapsody, Somebody to Love, Crazy Little Thing Called Love, and We Will Rock You.
Too late, my time has come. Oh, somebody, ooh, somebody, get anybody. Buddy, you're an old man, poor man, pleading with your eyes, gonna make you zombie someday.
They had 7 number ones in the 80s. We have Another One Bites the Dust, Flash, Radio Gaga, I Want to Break Free, Under Pressure, A Kind of Magic, and for some reason, I simply cannot fathom, France sent Invisible Man to number 1 right at the end of the decade. I don't know.
Another one bites the dust. It's for every one of us. Stand for every one of us. It's time with the body and every mouth. Your finest hour. Radio. Oh, I want to be free, baby. Oh, how I want to
Tipping around, keep my brains on the floor.
I'm in your room. I'm in your bed. And I'm in your life.
And then in the 90s, we have 2 more number ones. We have Innuendo, and then we have These Are the Days of Our Lives, which was a double A-side, which hit number 1 in the UK with Bohemian Rhapsody.
Free with your tempo. Be free, be free. So those were the days of our lives.
13 number ones then. Wow. So it took me a shockingly long time to actually get to the bottom of all this. So I do hope I got it right. There seems to be just loads of misinformation out there regarding which songs actually got to number 1. This little fact that every member composed at least one number 1 hit is often repeated on social media, Reddit and Twitter in particular, but no one ever seems to actually agree on which songs that list includes. A list on Reddit, for example, says that Fat Bottom Girls, You're My Best Friend, and Who Wants to Live Forever all reached number 1, but I could not actually confirm any of them reaching number 1 in any country, on any national chart. But then it misses out, for example, Flash, which definitely did hit number 1 in Austria. So leaving that aside for now, who wrote what? So from the get-go, we can discount a couple number 1s from our little factoid. Innuendo, for example, was a UK number 1 in 1991, and it was credited to the band as a whole. It was written primarily by Freddie and Roger, whilst having contributions from everyone, and that also includes the Yes guitarist Steve Howe, who added a cool bit of flamenco guitar. So obviously that can't count to our little discussion here. Under Pressure was a number 1 in the mid-80s, and that was also credited to the band as a whole and to David Bowie. So again, we'll have to look elsewhere for number 1s composed solely by one member. And one more, Invisible Man, which was also, again, credited to the entire band, as is, in fact, These Are the Days of Our Lives, although both are interesting cases that we'll get back to later on. So if we just look at the rest of them, and we look at it band member by band member, Freddie has the sole songwriting credit on 3 number 1s. Bohemian Rhapsody got to number 1 in loads of countries, including the UK, Belgium, Canada, Ireland, Netherlands, New Zealand, when it was first released in 1975, and it reached number 1 again in the UK in the early 90s as part of the aforementioned double A-side with These Are the Days of Our Lives. Somebody to Love reached number 1 in the Netherlands, and Crazy Little Thing Called Love reached number 1 in Australia, Canada, the USA, and the Netherlands. And it's also worth saying here that We Are the Champions did not actually reach number 1. Another Freddie song, and of course one of Queen's most famous. I see lots of people counting this song as one of their number 1s. But unfortunately, it didn't actually reach number 1 anyway. I will get back to this literally just in a few seconds. Oh, and also, Don't Stop Me Now, also not a number 1. People, again, often cite this as a number 1, but it wasn't. It just didn't quite get there anywhere, according to my research. Right, and then on to Brian May. He had 2 number 1s. That's Flash, as I said before, number 1 in Austria in 1980, and We Will Rock You. So this is a hard one to get to the bottom of. You see, in most countries, We Will Rock You was the B-side to We Are the Champions, which did very well across many countries, but didn't quite top any chart. For some reason, We Will Rock You was actually the A-side in France, though, and a couple of other countries, and it did get to number 1 in France. Way. So I have no idea why it was switched around there in France. I wonder if there was a mistake or whether someone simply chose to switch A and B sides just for a couple places. But that's what happened. And it also wasn't a double A side with We Are the Champions. It was the sole A side. I think because in many countries, We Are the Champions and We Will Rock You were actually released as an A side. Or in many other countries, We Are the Champions was released solely as the A-side. When people see that We Will Rock You top the charts in France, they kind of get a bit muddled and assume it's actually a number 1 for the B-side in France, which was We Are the Champions. It's a bit messy, isn't it? The point is, technically, the number 1 will have to go to We Will Rock You as the A-side in France, which is the only place that it got to number 1. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Anyway, John Deacon also got 2 number 1s. That's Another One Bites the Dust, which was massive, and I Want to Break Free in 1984, which got to number 1 in Austria, Belgium, and the Netherlands. So, Roger Taylor. Things get a little trickier here as 2 of his number 1s occurred after they had decided as a band to credit all members of the band with their songs. So this means that he is solely credited with 2 number 1s, but then there are later 2 also to discuss. So the 2 that he does get the sole credit for are Radio Gaga from 1984, which was number 1 in a bunch of countries, and A Kind of Magic, which reached number 1 in Argentina and Spain. As I said before, These Are the Days of Our Lives did get to number 1, but wasn't credited solely to Roger, instead being credited to the entire band, and it was part of a double A-side with Bohemian Rhapsody. So it is hard to know how to include it. I mean, it's a double A-side with Queen's best, most popular, and most famous to this day song. It's given equal billing rather than being a sole A-side. And I feel maybe Bohemian Rhapsody is doing a lot of heavy lifting. I don't know. We'll keep it in for now. We'll get back to it later when we discuss Roger's number 1s in a bit more detail. And then also, as I've mentioned before, Invisible Man is generally seen as a Roger song in spite of the joint credit. So there we have it. Each member has, in fact, written at least 2 number ones credited solely to them. Not even the Beatles can boast this feat. Thanks, Ringo. And it's a well-known, oft-touted achievement. As I said before, it pops up occasionally on Reddit and other social media sites, and Wikipedia itself says the band is the only group in which every member has composed more than one chart-topping single. It's also one of these things that just pops up in everyday life. I've actually had an argument with one of my friends about this. She might be watching. If you are, Katie, you're wrong and I'm right, so just keep watching. The problem is, though, this impressive fact is kind of not really true. At least, it's not true in the straightforward way that the commonly repeated fact seems to state it. It's not true in the way that many people do understand it, and it's not true in the way that you would expect most people to understand it when they hear it. So take careful note of the exact words used on Wikipedia and in the Reddit posts. It doesn't say that Queen are the only band in which every member is solely credited with more than one chart-topping single, which is true. It just says composed. And this is precisely where my problem with this fact lies. It's just wrong. I will admit I'm being a pedantic nerd about this, but what are you going to do? Just to be clear, and I feel I need to get this out of the way given the internet's propensity for taking things personally, I am a huge Queen fan. My aim here isn't to tear them down or besmirch their reputation or annoy the fanatics. It's just an attempt to explore a topic in an accurate, hopefully interesting way. They are undoubtedly one of the absolute greatest bands of all time, and some random small-time YouTuber isn't going to change that, nor would I ever want to. So, right, you're going to want an explanation, right? Why do I consider this little fact untrue? Well, there are a few elements to my objection, and in order to fully explain myself, we'll need to take a little or a large detour first, and we're going to explore the relationship between songwriting or composition and songwriting credits in popular music. The general takeaway point for this, and I'll just tell you up front, then explain, is that the relationship between songwriting and songwriting credits is often pretty tenuous. The names listed on any songwriting credit can be misleading to someone who doesn't really understand the individual band or artist, or even more broadly, the generic context of the music. All a songwriting credit does is tell you who is legally recognized as the songwriter, who gets the songwriting royalties, basically. It tells you less, sometimes much less, sometimes nothing, and sometimes something downright misleading about who the songwriter actually is, or who the songwriters actually are. So let's look at a few interesting examples, some famous, some maybe a little bit less so, and explore the ways they may mislead the casual music fan. Okay, so let's start at an obvious place, probably the most famous songwriting partnership of all time, Lennon and McCartney. I think virtually every semi-serious music fan today is at least vaguely aware that seeing the Lennon-McCartney songwriting credit on a song doesn't mean that the songwriting was written by both McCartney and Lennon together. Even when it does mean that, it's very rarely in equal measure. It was simply a songwriting partnership, definitely more of a legal arrangement past a certain point than a strictly accurate description of who wrote what. We know, for example, that John didn't have any input into Yesterday.
Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far.
But he still gets the credit. Nor did Paul contribute much, or I think actually at all, to Across the Universe.
Words are flowing out like endless rain.
And then we've also got to take into consideration that even on the songs that are generally considered solely or mostly Paul or John songs, there is still a lot of disagreement on who actually wrote what and how much. I don't think in a lot of cases we're ever going to get right to the bottom of the actual truth, but the point is that it's a mess. In some cases, it's just a complete mess. This messiness extends past the McCartney-Lennon songwriting partnership, even to George and Ringo's songs. Taxman, for example, is simply a George song according to the credits, but he definitely got a lot of help from John on the lyrics, and yet John isn't credited. And then George, in turn, helped Ringo quite a lot with Octopus's Garden, but it's solely credited to Ringo.
Then stay on as good, different shades. Then this, what was that?
That's not even to mention George Martin's contributions. Should he have gotten some credits? Maybe. He contributed enough that I can confidently say in another band under a different arrangement, he would have gotten some songwriting credits on top of his production credits, but he never seemed bothered by the fact that he didn't. Indeed, he thought it inappropriate that he would. And that's fair enough. That's how the Beatles functioned, and that was their relationship with their producer. There's nothing wrong with that. So, although there has been a bit of contention through the decades, like Paul wanting his name listed for John's on songs that were entirely or mostly his, or disagreements about how much each person contributed, some of these disagreements were quite highly publicized, being on, some kind of interview or something like that. None of the Beatles ultimately, or George Martin, ever seemed overly unhappy with how it worked. Flying halfway around the world now to Jamaica, arguably Bob Marley's most famous song, No Woman, No Cry, isn't even credited to Bob. The songwriter is instead supposedly one Vincent Ford, a friend of Marley's who owned a soup kitchen. It was always my understanding that this song was credited to Vincent simply in order to ensure that Bob's friend had a source of income to help support his soup kitchen. Obviously, that's a very nice thing to do, but it means that the songwriting credit is deeply misleading, potentially. But I have since found out that there is indeed a chance that this Vincent may have at least contributed something to the songwriting of No Woman No Cry. There is a fair bit of messiness to the whole story then, and it's a story which raises further questions about uncredited input Bob may or may not have received from others on any of his songs. Either way, Bob Marley isn't credited on No Woman No Cry, but he definitely had at least a huge role in its writing. And there are many, many other odd little stories out there around songwriting credits in loads of bands. I've talked about this before in an old video, but there's Don't Believe a Word by Thin Lizzy.
Don't believe me if I tell you.
Which almost certainly should be co-credited to Brian Robertson and Brian Downey, who played a massive part in how the song sounds, but it isn't. According to the credits, it's solely written by Phil Lynott, and we know for a fact that at least one of the Brians, Brian Robertson, is not happy with the fact that he's not credited on that. Less contentiously, and actually rather trivially, there's the Beach Boys' great song, Breakaway.
I can't break away from that lonely life.
Which is credited to Brian Wilson and some guy called Reggie Dunbar. Reggie Dunbar is just a made-up name that his dad, Murray, insisted on being listed as. Why? Well, according to Brian, he was just a weird dude. Runs in the family, I guess.
My name is Brian and I'm the man. I write hit songs with the wave of my hand.
Stories like this, and I'm sure much weirder and much more confusing, are out there in every style, every genre, and virtually every artist's catalogue. But how is this all relevant to Queen? Well, the point is that each band, each artist, and sometimes each songwriting partnership in each band has its own context and unique arrangement regarding how credits work. Lennon-McCartney was a legal construct as much as, and eventually much more than, a songwriting reality. Queen are no different. They had an agreement, or a set of agreements that changed a bit throughout time, about how to credit their songs, starting with their 1973 song Liar and ending with their 1986 album Kind of Magic. Queen decided to credit songs to the person who either wrote the bulk of the lyrics or simply originated the song idea, even if other members contributed significantly. So when you're reading the liner notes or a Wikipedia page or whatever for one of their albums and you see, say, Freddie Mercury listed as the sole composer for a song, it doesn't mean, for one, that he composed every single note and lyric in that song. I'm sure John Deacon, for example, didn't play from precisely composed sheet music on... Actually, I don't think he did it at all on any of Freddie or Brian or Roger's tunes. And so, in a way, co-composed anything that he played on. But that's maybe taking it too literally. After all, pop music never credits someone just for contributing a bit of a bass line or riff, or a drum fill, or whatever. If it did, then you'd most likely see every drummer, every bassist, every instrumentalist credited as a songwriter on every rock song ever written, even if they're just a session musician. To be honest, in popular music, there is almost never such a thing as a truly soul-composed song. It's very, very rare. Now, of course, there isn't a problem with any of this, or at least there's no problem with this when the band members have no problem with this. But Well, loads of bands do end up having problems with this, and the individual members of Queen certainly did. There were loads of arguments and disagreements arising from this arrangement that they had, crediting only the originator of a song, and is precisely why they changed that agreement in the late 80s. But also, this whole thing just makes it harder for us to understand what is actually going on in terms of songwriting, which I think for me is more important, right? I don't particularly care who gets the royalties from a song. It doesn't impact me whatsoever. But I do care, and I am interested in how it was written and who contributed. So obviously, we're going to need to look at some specific songs rather than just talking about it all generally to see where the credits potentially miscommunicate the compositional reality. So, Freddie Mercury songs first. From everything I've read, Freddie's songs were usually the most fully formed without the involvement of the rest of the band. Even here though, lots of his best known tunes were, if we're going to be annoyingly literal and pedantic about it, which I am, just briefly at least, jointly composed by other band members. Bohemian Rhapsody is as good a start. Bohemian Rhapsody seems as good a place to start as any, right? Again, I've already mentioned this in an older video, but part of me does think that maybe Brian May might deserve a songwriting credit on Bohemian Rhapsody for writing the guitar solo and his guitar parts. His contributions are substantial enough given how impactful those guitar parts are, and they are a larger part of the song's artistic and, I think, commercial success. I mean, come on, the guitar solo speaks for itself, right? And that's definitely his composition. Freddie didn't write it for him. So maybe he deserves a songwriting credit here. But he himself doesn't seem that bothered by not getting that credit. So fair enough. Who am I to say otherwise? That's the arrangement they had as a band, and they all agreed to it. And Freddie does seem to have written the overwhelming bulk of the music and all of the lyrics. But an important point here is that lots of non-musical people or people who haven't looked closely at this stuff do genuinely think that when a songwriting credit has one name, like Bohemian Rhapsody, that means that person composed the entirety of it. Maybe this seems silly to you, but it's really not. So I've had this discussion with loads of people, and it is quite common. That's the only reason I mention it. So at the very least, I think it's important to be properly informed on the topic. Anyway, ultimately, I do think actually that Freddie is deserving of at least the massive bulk of his sole credit. There is obviously some middle ground here, a middle ground that most popular music exists on, where we recognize if someone does most of the substantive songwriting, the little additions don't need to be credited to someone else. That's just the norm in popular music, whether that's rock, pop, folk, metal, most music really. Like, I play banjo in my band, and if I add a banjo part to a song written by someone else, even if it's a super cool banjo part, and it always is, I don't get to claim any songwriting credit on that, nor do I get a credit for writing a guitar solo or coming up with my own little bass riff. It's just not really how it works. This is, of course, like everything, largely a function of genre. Every broad genre takes a different approach to compositional accreditation. When it comes to classical, any contributor to a composition or just a general piece of music is understood as a collaborator, though they're not necessarily always going to be credited explicitly. Then in jazz, the songwriting credit for a recorded piece goes to whoever wrote the song that the quite possibly very different end result is based on. Hence why a jazz artist can cover a popular song, make it sound totally different, but the listed songwriter or songwriters will still be whoever wrote the original tune, which can seem a little bit unfair, but again, that's just how it is. And then there's rap and other heavy sample-based genres which have their own well-known difficulties with giving credit appropriately. And then blues, where almost every song is kind of just the same thing over and over and over again, and everyone is just constantly ripping each other off, but everyone is okay with it. So anyway, apologies for the lengthy digression, but it is important. Now let's move on to Brian. His number ones were We Will Rock You, then just a couple years later, Flash. Like Freddie, Brian's songs didn't really seem to need much help from the other members, and he largely seemed to function as an independent songwriter. On this, Freddie once said, Brian's got his own sort of writing ideas, and they're very strong to start with anyway. I don't seem to be able to get into his ideas so much. but in a way that's quite good. I'd rather leave it to him, and it doesn't mean I stay out of it altogether. I sort of let him do it. Based on that, and based on my reading of literally everything and anything I could find about their discography, mainly these two books, I'm very much inclined to believe that Brian's songwriting credits, like Freddie's, are pretty well deserved. Both Flash and We Will Rock You, his two number ones, are, according to Is This a Real Life and Queen, all the songs, those books I just mentioned, they're both quite comfortably soul Brian songs, by the standards that we would apply for any pop or rock artist. So it's worth lingering briefly here before ending part one on the question of why so many people erroneously list Fat Bottom Girls and Who Wants to Live Forever as Brian number ones. He's not the only person in the band who gets this treatment from fans. You're My Best Friend, attributed to John, is also claimed to have hit number one, but as far as I can tell, didn't anywhere either. I can't really get to the bottom of how or why this misinformation gets out there, though I suspect it's largely just down to the success and fame of these songs. Plenty of Queen singles went platinum, for example, without ever hitting number one, and plenty of others are now incredibly famous or popular without getting to number one or going platinum. I reckon that people just assume certain songs hit number one and then others just roll with it. Let's be honest, it's pretty easy for misinformation to spread on the internet. I mean, if the internet's famous for anything, it's misinformation. Virtually no one fact checks anything. And, you know, let's be honest, let's be frank, it's not as if Queen number ones is the most important thing in the world to be fact-checking. But that's why I'm doing it. Anyway, to prevent this video getting too ridiculously long, I'll end this first part here, and at some point soon we'll also release part two, where we'll be moving on to John Deacon songs, Roger's songs, and then wrapping it all up. So thanks for watching so far. Please subscribe and share if you like this video. Also check out all the other videos I made and, you know, watch this space for the next one. Cheers.